Have you ever wondered if what we call protection might actually be self-imposed imprisonment? In the twilight years of life, many parents feel a magnetic pull toward their children, a desire to stay close, to be near those they once nurtured. It seems natural, but what if this instinct isn't rooted in love alone? What if, beneath this desire, there lies a fear, a profound unconscious terror of irrelevance, loneliness, and death? Carl Jung believed that the second half of life should not be a repetition of the first, where the first half is dominated by outward expansion, career, family, identity. The second half must turn inward. But our modern culture, obsessed with youth and external validation, teaches the elderly to cling instead of release. Closeness to children can seem like a lifeline, yet paradoxically, it may sever the very path to the inner journey Jung called individuation. The parental instinct, powerful and sacred in its purpose, risks becoming pathological when it refuses to let go. By over-identifying with the role of parent, the ego defends against the terrifying truth that the self must now walk alone toward the depths of the unconscious. The comfort of familial proximity can numb this call. We begin to trade existential purpose for superficial connection. Jung warned of this illusion. He saw the human soul as a dynamic system always seeking wholeness. But wholeness demands confrontation with our fears, our solitude, our unfulfilled dreams. Living near one's children may ease the fear of decline, but it can also delay the psychological metamorphosis the soul yearns for in old age. In seeking safety, we might actually be hiding from ourselves, our true self. And in doing so, we burden our children not just with our needs, but with our unrealized selves. Safety becomes the cage. Proximity becomes stagnation. The very instinct that once gave life now prevents the rebirth of the individual. In the end, Jung's wisdom whispers something radical. The real home we must return to in old age is not our child's neighborhood. It's the symbolic home within, the landscape of dreams, symbols, and shadows that we have spent a lifetime avoiding. That is where freedom begins, not in comfort, but in courageous solitude. It often begins with love. A mother or father chooses to live near their children in old age, hoping for shared moments, support, and affection. But behind the surface of this decision, hidden in the folds of the unconscious, something else begins to stir: resentment, guilt, frustration, emotions no one dares name out loud. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the repressed, denied parts of ourselves that do not disappear but wait silently in the dark. The shadow doesn't vanish with age. On the contrary, as roles dissolve and identity fragments in the later stages of life, the shadow gains power. When we depend too much on our children to fill emotional voids, we unconsciously transfer expectations they never agreed to fulfill. Jung warned that any time we project our unintegrated self onto others, we create imbalance. A parent, in this case, may project their need for purpose, company, or validation onto their child without realizing it. The child begins to feel responsible not just for logistics, but for their parents' inner world. A subtle emotional weight settles between them. Emotional proximity under these circumstances can morph into quiet manipulation. A sigh when the child cannot visit. A passive-aggressive comment about being alone. A melancholic silence. It's not malice, it's the shadow acting through us, using guilt as a tether. The parent feels unseen, the child feels trapped. Love turns into obligation, closeness becomes tension. Worse yet, the parent may sense their own dependency, but feel powerless to change. This internal conflict feeds shame, another product of the shadow. And because these feelings are rarely acknowledged, especially in cultures that idealize family, unity, they fester in silence. Jung would insist this is not evil, it is simply unconsciousness. And the only way to dissolve the toxic fog is to bring these patterns to light, to recognize the dependency, to own it, to explore the unmet needs that drive it. Only then can the relationship be rebalanced, not around obligation, but mutual respect and adult individuation? The truth is, emotional independence is not a betrayal of love. It's a purification of it. The closer we come to death, the more urgent it becomes to release false attachments and take responsibility for our inner lives. Our children are not our saviors. They are fellow travelers with their own path. To confuse love with dependence is to entangle both journeys in unnecessary suffering. By confronting our own shadows in old age, we give a final gift to our children, the gift of freedom. Not from us, but from the unspoken emotional burdens we may have placed upon them. And in doing so, we liberate ourselves too. What if aging was not a decline, but an initiation? What if the later years of life were not meant for clinging to roles and routines, but for a sacred journey into the self? Carl Jung believed that the second half of life holds a purpose just as vital as the first, the process of individuation, the unfolding of one's true self, distinct from all masks, roles, and societal expectations. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not comfort. It is the confrontation with everything we have avoided, our shadow, our fears, our unlived dreams, and even the reality of death. For Jung, this was the central task of aging, and it is a journey that cannot be outsourced, not to children, not to doctors, not to the familiar rhythms of daily life. To live too closely to one's children in old age, physically or emotionally, can unknowingly hinder this path. When a parent shapes their daily existence around the lives of their adult children, they risk living in a reflection, not in their own light. Jung might call this a refusal of the soul's call, a turning away from the deeper invitation of individuation. The archetype of the wise elder is not the one who clings to their descendants, but the one who has traveled inward and emerged with insight. And that journey requires solitude, reflection, and even symbolic death, the death of the identity that was once parent, provider, protector. What emerges in its place is not emptiness, but essence. This is where autonomy becomes sacred. Autonomy is not isolation. It is the psychic space needed for the ego to dissolve and for the deeper self to rise. Jung saw the self as the totality of the psyche, the whole person, conscious and unconscious. And only through individuation does this self come into full view. Living near one's children may offer comfort, but it often creates noise, emotional noise, relational patterns, expectations, all of which can drown out the subtle whispers of the unconscious. To individuate, the elderly must retreat from the known, not abandon, but transcend. Only then can they engage with life, not as a parent or grandparent, but as a soul, completing its cycle. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold. In youth, we build and conquer. In age, we dissolve and refine. The real task is not to remain relevant to others, but to become whole within ourselves. That is where peace lies, not in proximity, but in inner integration. So if you find yourself fearing solitude in your later years, ask yourself, is it loneliness I fear, or the silence that might reveal who I truly am? At a certain point in life, a strange transformation occurs. What once felt like a journey forward begins to circle back. Time folds, the past reappears in dreams, and regrets take on the shape of questions left unanswered. In this phase, many aging parents draw closer to their children, not just out of affection, but out of something deeper, less conscious. They want to see themselves again. But what they often see is not a reflection. They see a projection. Carl Jung devoted much of his work to the phenomenon of projection, the unconscious transfer of our own inner material onto others. He warned that the parts of ourselves we fail to recognize, the unlived passions, the missed chances, the suppressed pain, do not disappear. Instead, they find their way out, latching onto those closest to us. In old age, children often become the unwitting screens upon which these psychic images are cast. When we live too near to our children, physically or psychologically, This tendency intensifies. The proximity allows for constant comparison, interference, and silent expectations. We see our child make choices we wouldn't have dared. We feel irritation when they fail to call or include us. We experience a strange emotional hunger when their lives seem full, while ours grow quieter. And then, subtly, the boundary blurs. We want their lives to go a certain way, not because it's best for them, but because it somehow redeems our own path. This is the projection trap. It doesn't look like manipulation. It rarely even looks like interference. Often it's dressed in care. I just want what's best for you, or concern. I'm worried about your choices. But underneath lies the shadow of our own unlived life, the career we never pursued, the travels we postponed, the relationships we avoided. Jung believed that unless we confront these inner ghosts, they will haunt the outer world, and the ones who suffer first are those closest to us. Children begin to feel misunderstood, micromanaged, or emotionally burdened. They might not know why your presence feels heavy, why your comments cut deeper than they should, but what they feel, unconsciously, is the weight of your unprocessed self. And you, in turn, may sense their growing distance with confusion, even pain, unaware that what you seek in them is not companionship, but completion. The great tragedy is that this projection is unnecessary. The individuation process that Jung championed offers a radical alternative to reclaim those lost parts of ourselves, not through our children, but within, to travel back through memory, to mourn the choices we didn't make and to make peace with them, to pick up the threads of curiosity, creativity and wonder that we abandoned, and to follow them now with the time that remains. Proximity to children can comfort the ego, but it rarely nourishes the soul. The soul does not want to watch someone else live its unlived life. It wants to be whole, and wholeness begins where projection ends, when we stop trying to live through others and begin to live through ourselves, no matter our age. Jung wrote that we meet our destiny on the road we take to avoid it. For many in old age, that road is the path back into the self, a path not marked by external validation, but by quiet inner reckoning, a path that leads not to our children's front door, but to the unvisited corridors of our own psyche. There's a quiet kind of suffering that goes unnoticed in old age, not pain of the body, but pain of the soul. It's not loud, it doesn't scream, it settles like dust into the corners of the psyche. It shows up in restless nights, in a vague sense of emptiness, in a growing disinterest in the world. The outer life may seem stable, family nearby, needs met, but inside, something vital has gone missing. Something sacred has been silenced. Carl Jung called this the consequence of ignoring the inner calling. For him, every human life contains two movements. The first is outward, toward building identity, family, achievement. The second is inward, a descent into the psyche, a journey into meaning, symbol, and the deeper self. But most people, Jung warned, resist this second path. It is uncomfortable. It requires letting go of who we were and daring to meet who we truly are beneath the surface. In old age, this refusal comes at a heavy cost. When the external world no longer demands our full attention and the roles we once played begin to dissolve, we are faced with a mirror. Who am I, now that I am no longer necessary to others? For many, the answer is terrifying, and instead of facing that void, they run from it. They anchor themselves in the lives of their children, in routines, in comfort zones. But comfort without depth becomes decay. Jung saw this clearly. He believed that every human being has a destiny, not just to live, but to become whole, to become reconciled with their inner contradictions, to become aware of the shadow and no longer ruled by it. But this becoming requires solitude, reflection, and above all, courage. A soul that stagnates begins to rot from within. You may not see it at first, but it's there. In the loss of wonder, the absence of curiosity, the slow withdrawal from mystery, the world becomes flat, life becomes repetitive, and the spirit, once vibrant and intuitive, begins to whisper less and less, until one day it goes silent. This is not how it has to be. Jung taught that even in late life, the soul remains alive, yearning, waiting. The dream world becomes louder, symbols emerge, archetypes stir beneath the surface. The old myths come back, not just as stories, but as blueprints for the next stage of life. The individual must listen, not to the voices of family or society, but to the inner guide, the self, speaking through images, intuition, and synchronicity. To ignore this is to wither while appearing well. It is to die, with the soul unfulfilled. But to answer this call even now is to awaken something eternal, to become once again a seeker, not of youth, but of meaning. And that, Jung believed, is the real task of growing old. In every culture, in every ancient myth, there is a figure who appears when the hero is lost, the wise old man. Sometimes he lives in a cave, sometimes in a tower. He is distant, quiet, mysterious, but he holds a truth that no one else can give. For Carl Jung, this figure was not just a character. It was an archetype, a symbol of the highest potential of the aging soul. But here's the paradox. To become the wise elder, one must step away. Withdrawal is not abandonment. It is not giving up on life. It is a sacred retreat, a conscious turning inward to integrate a lifetime of experiences, thoughts, and emotions. Jung saw this as the culmination of individuation, not just becoming yourself, but becoming a vessel for the transpersonal, for the deep wisdom of the unconscious to rise through you. In modern society, aging is feared. Elders are often expected to stay young, stay busy, stay close. But Jung would argue the opposite. The elder's role is to see what others cannot, to hear what others drown out with noise, and to do that, one must separate, not permanently but meaningfully. Living too close to your children can disrupt this process. The daily noise of life, the subtle expectations, the constant focus on others, it all distracts from the silent work of the soul. The wise old man archetype can't emerge in the chaos of caretaking and dependence. He needs silence, space, solitude. This doesn't mean elders should isolate completely. Jung was clear. True individuation integrates both self and society. But the balance must be recalibrated. The center of gravity must shift inward. When this happens, something beautiful occurs. Wisdom begins to radiate, not as opinion, but as presence. The elder becomes not a source of solutions, but of insight. Not someone who answers questions, but someone whose very being invites reflection. This archetype is not gendered. It appears in men and women alike. The wise old woman, the crone, the grandmother earth figure, they all carry the same essence, the one who has seen the cycles of life and returned transformed. To embody this is to become an anchor in your family, not by proximity, but by depth. Your presence becomes sacred, not demanded. Your words carry weight, not because you repeat them often, but because you speak from beyond the ego. And your children come to you, not because they must, but because they feel something in you that the world no longer offers. Silence, mystery, and meaning. This is what Jung envisioned for the aging soul. Not retirement, not retreat, but revelation. And for that revelation to arrive, we must step away, not from love, but from distraction, not from family, but from false identity. Only then can the archetype awaken. Only then can the elder become whole. It begins so gently. A parent aging seeks to remain close to their children, not just for help, but for connection, continuity, a shared life. At first, it seems like love, a beautiful gesture. But slowly, invisibly, the air starts to change. Expectations creep in, roles solidify, conversations become loaded, and what once was affection now feels like obligation. Carl Jung knew this terrain well. not in logistics, but in the invisible dynamics of the psyche. He warned that when relationships are no longer animated by spontaneity, but by duty, something essential dies. The soul begins to suffocate under the weight of expectations, both spoken and silent. Living near your children in old age may feel like a solution to fear, fear of decline, fear of loneliness, fear of death. But if this closeness is not freely chosen by both sides, it becomes a psychological cage, not one of bars and locks, but of guilt and subtle resentment. It is no longer, "I want to be with you," but "I must be with you." And that shift changes everything. Jung believed in the sacredness of human connection, but he also emphasized the necessity of psychic space. Each person carries their own process of individuation. When that process is interrupted by intrusion, overprotection, or dependency, both souls suffer. The elder begins to shrink into passivity, their inner journey halted by distraction. The child begins to rebel, emotionally or silently, caught between love and the need to breathe. This is the tragedy of bonds that suffocate. They were forged in love, but hardened into expectations. They limit rather than liberate, and worst of all, they often remain unspoken. The mother who sighs instead of asking, the father who withdraws when not visited, the child who smiles politely while longing to escape, all of them trapped by a love that no longer feels free. The only escape from this quiet prison is honesty, radical, compassionate honesty. To name what's happening, to allow space, to choose presence over proximity, because true love doesn't bind, it releases. It allows the other to be fully themselves, even if that means being apart. Jung taught that we must be able to stand alone before we can love completely. And in old age, this becomes more important than ever. Not to be a burden, not to demand energy that is not freely given, but to be a source of light by being whole in oneself. Sometimes, the most loving thing an elder can do is let go, not of the bond, but of the need to control it. To let love breathe again, to allow silence without shame, to choose autonomy not as defiance, but as a gift to oneself and to the next generation. They carry it in their posture, in the hesitation before answering a call, in the sigh after a visit that should have felt joyful. It's the weight no one talks about, the emotional burden of being the central figure in a parent's later life world. It's not about caregiving. It's not about helping with groceries or appointments. It's something far heavier and far more invisible. Carl Jung understood that emotional dynamics within families often go unexamined, pass silently from one generation to the next. When a parent depends too much on their child for emotional sustenance, it creates a psychic imbalance. The child, consciously or not, begins to carry not only their own life, but also the unmet emotional needs of their parent. And over time, this becomes a kind of psychological enmeshment, a merging of roles where love is laced with a guilt, where presence becomes obligation. This is not what most parents intend. They simply want to feel connected, supported, remembered. But when the connection becomes a lifeline, when the parent's well-being hinges on the child's availability, something vital is lost: the child's autonomy. Jung would describe this as a failure in psychic boundaries. The individuation process, essential for both parent and child, is interrupted. The child cannot fully explore their own path, their own becoming, when they are tethered by emotional expectations they did not choose. The parent, in turn, clings not to love but to identity, a fading identity that once centered on caregiving, now inverted into needing care. This creates a feedback loop of subtle resentment. The parent wonders why the child seems distant. The child wonders why every interaction feels so heavy. There is love, yes, but it's strained, shaped by unsaid obligations. And the longer this persists, the more both parties suffer. Jung believed that every relationship must evolve, The relationship between parent and child is no exception. It must mature from dependency to mutual recognition. The child must be allowed to be an adult, not a caretaker, not an emotional crutch, but a sovereign being with their own journey. And the parent must step into the archetype of the elder, not the dependent, but the guide, the witness, the one who has learned to hold their own solitude with grace. This transformation is not easy. It requires introspection. The parent must ask, am I offering love or seeking to fill my own emptiness? The child must ask, am I showing up out of care or out of guilt? Only when these questions are faced honestly can the weight begin to lift. When the bond is rebalanced, something beautiful emerges. The visits become lighter, the conversations deeper. The relationship is no longer built on need but on freedom. The parent becomes not a burden, but a source of quiet wisdom. The child, no longer shackled by invisible expectations, returns by choice, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection. And in that space, real love grows. Solitude. For many, the word evokes fear. Fear of abandonment, of silence, of becoming invisible. In old age, solitude is often mistaken for loneliness, and loneliness for suffering. But what if solitude was not a punishment, but a portal? What if, as Carl Jung believed, solitude is the crucible where the soul is transformed? In the second half of life, the distractions that once kept us externally engaged begin to fall away. Careers end, children grow, roles dissolve, and then there is space. But for those unprepared, that space feels like emptiness. They rush to fill it with proximity, with television, with endless calls, anything but silence. Yet Jung taught that this silence holds the key to a profound transformation. He compared the psyche to an alchemical vessel, a container in which all the fragmented parts of the self can be brought together, heated and transmuted. And solitude is the fire. It is the condition necessary for the true work of the soul to begin. When one is no longer distracted by others' needs, they begin to feel the ache of their own. Desires that were buried under decades of responsibility rise to the surface. Memories resurface, not as nostalgia, but as symbols demanding meaning. Dreams become vivid. Emotions long repressed emerge. Grief, joy, shame, wonder. And the self, Jung's central archetype of wholeness, begins to stir. This process is painful. It requires letting go of illusions about who we were, what we achieved, what we never dared. It requires facing the shadow, the rejected parts of the self we spent a lifetime avoiding. But it also leads to liberation, because only in solitude can we begin to hear our true voice, unfiltered by roles, relationships, or expectations. Jung did not romanticize isolation. He knew that true solitude is not about being alone, but about being whole while alone. It's about becoming the container for one's own transformation. It is in this sacred space that the elder moves from being a consumer of life to a creator of meaning. In practical terms, this means choosing time alone, not as rejection, but as ritual. Walking without headphones, journaling without filters, sitting in silence, not to escape the world, but to enter one's own. It means reading, not to distract, but to encounter symbols that awaken inner dialogue. It means paying attention to dreams as messages from the deep psyche, and over time something shifts. The elder who once feared being alone begins to savor it. The silence becomes fertile, the days become sacred. The self, once fragmented, begins to cohere. This is the alchemy of solitude. It transforms isolation into illumination. Eventually, when the child visits, the dynamic has changed. The elder no longer clings. They offer presence, not pressure. And the child, sensing the shift, feels drawn, not out of guilt, but out of awe. Because in the stillness of that elder there is something rare, a person who has met themselves fully and emerged whole. This is the gift of solitude, not retreat from life, but return to essence. There's a delicate dance that begins in the later stages of life. It's the dance between holding on and letting go, between presence and absence, between staying close to those you love and stepping far enough back to allow freedom. Most struggle with it, few master it. But Carl Jung believed that this balance is not only possible, it's essential for the fulfillment of the aging soul. In our culture, love is often equated with proximity. We believe that being physically close, emotionally enmeshed, and constantly available is proof of care. But Jung's view of love was deeper, more paradoxical. He believed that love, in its highest form, includes distance, that to love someone fully is to allow them to be fully themselves, even if it means being apart. For aging parents, this truth is hard to accept. The desire to remain needed is strong. After decades of shaping and guiding their children, many parents unconsciously fear becoming irrelevant. They cling gently at first, but more tightly as time passes. Every visit missed feels like rejection, every silence like abandonment. But what if those silences are not absence, but space, sacred space, for both souls to grow? Jung taught that growth often requires withdrawal, that the elder must step back, not because they no longer care, but because they care enough to give freedom. Freedom to evolve, freedom to individuate, freedom to live without the invisible pull of obligation. At the same time, total absence can also wound. A cold detachment, a retreat into bitterness, or emotional withdrawal creates rupture. So how does one balance the two? How can an elder remain present, loving, wise, supportive, without suffocating the ones they love? The answer lies in presence without pressure, in choosing quality over quantity, in speaking truth with gentleness, in showing up without expecting reciprocation, in being a lighthouse, not a leash. This presence is powerful. It transforms the dynamic between parent and child. It allows the child to come freely, not out of guilt, but out of affection. And it gives the elder a new role, not one of dependence, but of quiet influence, of wisdom offered, not imposed. Jung would say, let the love evolve. Let it become quieter, deeper, freer. Let it transcend the ego's need to be needed and rise into the soul's desire to witness, to bless, to simply be. When love matures in this way, something magical happens. The bond becomes lighter. And paradoxically, the space created by distance often brings hearts closer than constant proximity ever could. When the external world begins to fade, when the routines, roles, and responsibilities that once defined life start to dissolve, the inner world calls louder than ever. In that vast internal space where silence replaces urgency, the question arises, what now? For many, this moment is terrifying. But for Carl Jung, it was sacred. Jung believed that the human psyche is guided not by logic alone, but by symbols, ancient universal images he called archetypes. These are the blueprints of the soul's journey. They appear in dreams, myths, religions, and art. And in the second half of life, when the outer world no longer offers clear meaning, it is these inner symbols that become the key to healing, purpose, and transcendence. In old age, symbols begin to surface with new force. Dreams become vivid. Certain stories resonate more deeply. A simple tree outside the window might begin to represent not just nature, but life itself. A winding path in a dream may speak of a soul still journeying. These aren't mere coincidences. They are the language of the unconscious, calling the elder toward integration. Jung taught that the aging process is a return, not to childhood, but to the self, the totality of who we are. And the path to that self is marked by archetypal encounters. The wise old man, the crone, the hero who must face death, the rebirth. These are not just literary devices, they are living energies within the psyche, guiding transformation. To engage with symbols is to allow the soul to speak. It is to realize that aging is not a slow erasure, but a symbolic unfolding. Every wrinkle, every loss, every change in pace carries meaning. Death itself, Jung said, is not an end, but a culmination, the final archetype in the myth of a human life. Healing in old age, then, does not come from denial, nor from clinging to youth. It comes from listening to dreams, to synchronicities, to the sudden tears that come without warning. It comes from recognizing that everything now is symbolic. The house no longer just a home, but a body. The empty chair no longer just furniture, but absence, memory, transition. The elderly person who begins to see symbolically reclaims their life from the mundane. They realize that their story is not over, that they are still in myth, still in movement, still called. And in this realization, suffering transforms. The fear of being alone gives way to the awe of self-discovery. The loss of roles becomes the freedom to explore. The nearness of death becomes the proximity of mystery. Jung's message is clear. Engage the symbols. Let the archetypes guide you. You are not fading. You are entering the most meaningful act of your life's story. What if aging is not a decline, but a rite of passage? Not a slow surrender to time, but a sacred transition into something larger, deeper, eternal. For Carl Jung, the later stages of life were not about fading away, but about preparing for a mystery no one escapes. Death, and not with fear, but with reverence. To Jung, death was not a wall, it was a door, and the life that leads to it must not be filled merely with comfort or distraction, but with preparation of the soul. He believed that the aging process reveals a hidden task, not to remain who you were, but to become who you truly are, to move from ego to essence, from outer form to inner truth. In the first half of life, we build, we construct identity, chase goals, raise families. The ego is active, necessary, but in the second half, the psyche demands a shift. The outer world loses its grip and the inner world begins to expand. Many resist this change. They try to remain relevant, active, central in others' lives, especially their children's. But Jung warned that clinging to roles long past, their time is a refusal of the spiritual task at hand. And what is that task? It is the descent, the return inward, the confrontation with death, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. It is the chance to reconcile with the unlived parts of yourself, to forgive, to let go, to integrate shadow and light. It is the movement from personal concerns to transpersonal awareness, from me to mystery. This is why Jung saw dreams in old age as especially potent. They often begin to carry symbols of departure, crossing water, leaving homes, arriving at unknown places. These are not random images. They are messages from the unconscious, preparing the soul for its final passage. To age spiritually means to listen, to slow down, to read poetry, to reflect on myth, to embrace ritual, to light candles not out of tradition, but as an act of inner reverence. It means no longer measuring life by achievement, but by meaning. No longer asking what is next, but what is eternal in what I've lived. It also means releasing others, not abandoning, but blessing them, freeing them from the burden of carrying your unresolved fears. It means becoming less of a presence in the daily chaos and more of a presence in the invisible field of memory, wisdom, and legacy. This is the preparation Jung envisioned. Not one of doctrine, but of deep encounter. Not one of religious dogma, but of spiritual awakening. He once said that as we age, we must let go of the hero and embrace the sage. And the sage knows death is not to be feared, it is to be met with awareness. In this awareness, the elder becomes radiant, not because of what they do, but because of who they've become. They are ready, not for an end, but for a return. To something larger, to something eternal, to something that perhaps was always waiting inside. There is a quiet form of leadership, almost imperceptible, that requires no stage, no applause, and no spotlight. It is not built on being the center of attention, but on being deeply rooted in one's own presence. Carl Jung understood this kind of influence. He believed that true wisdom does not impose, it emanates. It does not seek control, it inspires through being. As parents age, many struggle with the loss of centrality in their families. Once the providers, the decision-makers, the anchors, they now watch as their children navigate the world independently. This shift can be disorienting. Some fight it, clinging to old roles. Others retreat in bitterness. But there is a third path, the path of becoming presence itself. To be presence is to embody wisdom without needing to speak it, to offer insight without demand, to become a calm force in the storm of life. Jung would say, this is not passive, it is active stillness, a magnetism born of deep inner work. The person who has faced their shadow, reconciled their contradictions, and integrated their soul radiates a kind of peace that others feel, without knowing why. This kind of elder does not need to be needed. They do not interfere in their children's lives to affirm their worth. They have transcended that phase. Their joy is no longer tied to recognition, but to resonance. They can sit in silence and still be felt. They can speak few words and still leave an echo. In Jungian terms, they have become archetypal, not in fantasy, but in function. They embody the sage, the wise old one. They carry the accumulated meaning of a lifetime, not as stories to impose, but as living energy to offer. This is not about perfection. The inspiring elder is still human, still vulnerable, but they are no longer reactive. They do not try to control the narrative. They observe, they listen, they bless, and by doing so, they become exactly what younger generations need. Not instruction, but orientation. In a world obsessed with visibility, the elder becomes invisible in the best sense. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer need to be seen. Their very being speaks, and those who approach them feel something rare: peace, clarity, grounding. This is the true power of aging well. It's not about being remembered for what you did. It's about being recognized for what you are, a presence that heals simply by being. Time changes shape as we age. In youth, it stretches ahead, open, hungry, fast. In midlife, it becomes structured, urgent, filled with responsibilities. But in old age, it bends back on itself. The days slow, the routines soften, and with children grown and gone, a vast space opens. For many, this space feels empty, but for Carl Jung it was a canvas. Jung believed that the later years of life are not about waiting for the end, but about discovering a new kind of time, symbolic time, time not defined by calendars or clocks, but by meaning. This is where true purpose is reborn, not through others but from within. Living far from one's children or without frequent visits often triggers a crisis of identity. The roles once held, father, mother, protector, lose relevance. There are fewer calls, fewer needs to fulfill, and so the question echoes louder: what now? For Jung, the answer was simple yet profound: create. Not necessarily with paint or pen, though those are sacred tools, but with soul. Create meaning, create rituals, create space for the unconscious to speak. This might look like tending a garden, not just for beauty, but as a metaphor for one's inner life. It might be morning walks taken as acts of prayer, or dream journaling as a way to track the psyche's evolution. It might mean starting a small community circle, not for influence, but for connection. It might be reading myth, poetry, scripture, not as entertainment, but as orientation. When children are no longer central to daily life, time opens up in a way it never did before, and this time, Jung would say, is sacred. It is no longer borrowed, it is fully yours. It is the gift you didn't have while raising others. Now, it is the soul's turn to be raised. This does not mean turning away from family. It means no longer depending on them as the sole source of validation. It means reclaiming the self, not the social self, but the deep, archetypal self that Jung believed lies at the core of every human being. Those who do this, who rebuild their time with intention, find something remarkable. They begin to feel younger in a new way, not physically, but existentially. They wake with curiosity. They sleep with satisfaction. They become more interesting, not just to others, but to themselves. This is the true reawakening in old age. Not a return to what was, but a turning toward what could still be. Time, freed from obligation, becomes a sacred container, and within it, purpose blooms, not because it's assigned, but because it's chosen. When people speak of legacy, they often mean inheritance, property, possessions, heirlooms. But Carl Jung would say that our truest legacy is not stored in bank accounts or passed down in wills. It lives in the unconscious of those we leave behind. It is not what we gave them materially, but what we awakened in them spiritually. In the final stage of life, many elders become preoccupied with what they will leave. Some obsess over fairness, control, or recognition. Others fear being forgotten. But the most powerful legacy, Jung believed, is invisible. It's what remains when the stories are over, when the physical body is gone. It's the imprint left on the soul of another. And this legacy begins to take form long before death. It is shaped by presence, by how one chooses to live in the ordinary days. It is formed in how an elder handles uncertainty, expresses truth, or embraces solitude. It is found in the example they set, not through advice, but through authenticity. A spiritually mature elder understands this. They no longer seek to manage outcomes or shape others' lives to match their hopes. They trust that their real gift is not a set of instructions, but a way of being. Jung taught that when the self is realized, when one becomes whole, the energy that emanates from that person continues to ripple outward long after they've gone. This kind of legacy does not pressure. It inspires. It does not tie people down. It liberates. It does not require memory to remain alive. It is felt in intuition, in dreams, in moments of clarity when a grandchild, years later, faces a crossroads and suddenly feels the silent strength of a grandfather who once stood tall in silence. To leave this kind of legacy, one must first embrace the reality of death, not as a failure but as fulfillment. Jung believed that a life lived in the service of individuation becomes, in the end, a mythic story. And when such a life ends, the final act is not disappearance. It is integration into the greater whole. What your children inherit then is not just your voice or your letters. It is your courage, your curiosity, your ability to face darkness and still choose love, your refusal to be defined by age, your willingness to walk alone into mystery, not with despair, but with reverence. This is the legacy that matters. And in choosing to live it now, to become it, you already begin to leave it behind. As we reach the culmination of our exploration into the intricate dynamics of aging, autonomy, and the profound insights of Carl Jung, it's essential to reflect on the journey we've undertaken. We've delved into the psychological intricacies of individuation, the process by which an individual becomes whole, integrating various aspects of the self. Jung emphasized that this journey is not just a psychological endeavor, but a spiritual one, leading us toward a deeper understanding of our place in the universe. In the twilight years of life, the quest for meaning becomes paramount. Jung believed that the second half of life is characterized by a shift from external achievements to internal reflection. This period invites us to confront the unconscious, to reconcile with our shadow selves, and to embrace the totality of our being. It's a time when the ego's dominance wanes, allowing the self, the archetype of wholeness, to emerge more fully. This journey toward individuation is not undertaken in isolation. Our relationships, especially with our children, play a pivotal role. While the desire to remain close to our offspring in old age is natural, Jung cautioned against dependency that hinders personal growth. True individuation requires a balance between connection and autonomy, allowing both generations to flourish independently while maintaining meaningful bonds. Now, as we pivot from the psychological to the spiritual, we find a harmonious resonance in the words of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. This verse encapsulates the essence of divine love, a love that offers salvation and eternal life to all who believe. Jung's exploration of the self and the divine aligns with this message. He viewed the self as a symbol of the divine within us, guiding us toward wholeness and unity with the greater cosmos. The process of individuation, then, becomes a spiritual journey, leading us to a deeper connection with God. In embracing this path, we acknowledge that our worth is not solely defined by our roles or relationships, but by our intrinsic value as individuals created in the image of God. This realization empowers us to live authentically, to pursue our purpose, and to prepare for the ultimate transition from this life to the next. As we conclude this segment, I invite you to reflect on your own journey. Are you moving toward wholeness, embracing both your strengths and vulnerabilities? Have you considered the spiritual dimensions of your existence and the transformative power of divine love? In the next segment, we will delve deeper into the practical applications of these insights, exploring how to cultivate a life of purpose, autonomy, and spiritual fulfillment in our later years.